Hey, what up, people? Welcome to Seb One's Music Corner. Today, we're going to do something a little different, and we're going to talk a little bit about sound engineering. We're going to talk about this because, first of all, as of the timing of this video, I've just come back from New York and I've offered some advice to some people and gone around and checked out a few places. And also, I've spoken to a lot of dancers, and right now, we all want bang for our buck. I'm not sure if that's an expression in the States, but basically we want our money's worth, just like that fella who's trending on TikTok. So today's topic on Seb One's Music Corner is going to be about system setup. Now, this is not going to be advanced. This is not going to talk about, all the sort of things that you'd expect a sound engineer to be able to know and do and say, whatever. No, this is you, a dancer who maybe wants to rent a space for a jam, or maybe you're a dancer who wants to hold a battle at one of the many studios worldwide, and even though they have a setup, maybe you think it's not good enough, or how do you know if it's good or not? We're going to look at all of these things today, and we're going to examine them using very simple language so that you guys can basically understand how to get the most bang for your buck and the most boom and all that sort of stuff. So like I said, we're not going to go too deep into the technicalities. Everything you're going to be able to understand. We're going to start off with the very basics, and then we're going to go into basically what I consider, the ultimate, if you had all the money in the world, but if you had all the time in the world and you could do it, what would be the ideal solution, So without further ado, let's get cracking. What we're going to do is I'm going to fade this over to this next screen, which basically is a program that I use, and it's a free program. It's not very complicated in terms of what people on the market can do today and now. But basically what it does is it models speakers in rooms. So you can see roughly how much coverage and how loud it's going to get. Now, it's not going to do things like reflections. It's not going to do all that sort of fancy stuff, but it's just an idea to help illustrate a point, so I don't have to keep like drawing on the on a piece of paper or something. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so what we've got here is, you see here a rectangle. Now, this rectangle is going to be about 14 meters by 9.7 meters, or in American, about 40 feet by 20 something feet, basically. And the reason I've used it this way is because if you think about it, this is probably the size of most studios in, most dance studios. Now, a lot of dance studios, because you have to fit an instructor up here, and then you have the class back here. Most studios are going to be wider than they are long, and this presents some significant challenges when it comes to setting up speakers. Most studios will probably have the speakers probably on a stand. Some other studios might go further and wall mount them. We're going to basically look at what the different solutions and what the different possibilities are. So first of all, this little, if you can see it clearly, let me see if I can zoom that in for you. Here we go. Excellent. Okay, so we have our studio here. This one here is the listener or a random person. And what we're going to do is we're going to use these speakers. Now, this exact model speaker doesn't really matter. That's not what we're trying to get here. It's just a speaker. Now, let's say, for example, this person is standing and, they're about a certain height, an average height for standing. So let's say we place a speaker. And normally, when you go to these events, people just put speakers on a stand and they basically face them straight forward, like you can see here. Let me see if I can pull it out. Let me see if I can pull this out for you here. Right. So you can see here, the speaker is basically facing forward. Now, what happens if we have two of these in a room like this? So we will ignore the subwoofers for now. Yep. And we will just look at here. Now, these speakers, if you look at the side view at the bottom, which I'm going to show you in a second here, ignoring the subwoofers, you'll see that in this room, the speakers are almost level with the listener. If you can't see, this says side view, and it basically looks at it from I believe, a 90-degree difference. So there you can see the side view, the dancer is almost in the middle, and you have the two speakers facing that way. Now, if we do it that way, and we look at the side view from here, we see that the dancers are always going to be roughly in the middle. Now, what happens here? What happens here when we look at the frequency response is that generally you're going to get, some decent sound. You're going to get some sound, right? And we're going to show that with this color mapping. Now, it's not important what these color mappings mean. Obviously, red is hotter and green is not as hot, obviously. So you can see that with just two speakers, it can get quite loud in a studio. That seems very obvious. Okay, so red is very hot. As a matter of fact, at full pelt, about a meter away, you're looking at 130 to 128 dB, the red zone. In other words, you go deaf very quickly. Most of the time, they put these speakers against the walls because you need floor space. Now, what happens is that, and it's pretty obvious, you can see here that there's a blue zone. No matter where you point these, you're never going to get full coverage. So if the instructor was up here, you can aim the speakers and have a nice zone there, but the bottom half of the studio gets quieter. If you aim it for the back so that there is more of an even distribution, you have a quieter zone up here where the instructor or the teacher can't really hear themselves. So as an aside, the ideal setup would actually be to place a third speaker in the middle. Now, what you get from here is a much more even distribution. Now, there are some technicalities associated with this sort of setup. And that's a discussion for another time, but I'm just pointing out here that having three speakers is probably the go-to for most of these sort of spaces. However, let's just go back to two speakers and let's look at the setup. Now, what happens if right now we see the frequency response, it's going to get really loud, and then lower here where my mouse is, if you can see at the base, isn't that great. That's okay. We're just going to look at, for example, what happens when we raise the, so this is the height of the speakers. Let's see what happens when we raise the speaker height higher than the listening position. So if I raise these to say 3 meters, which is not impossible for a set of nice speaker stands, and certainly not impossible if they're mounted to the walls, what you'll see is the frequency response, even if I make it higher, it sort of smooths out, okay? And you can also see now, as I raise it higher, it becomes more and more even in the room because it's not directly pointed at the level with the listener. Okay, so height when putting speakers is always great, but as you can see from the side view, the speakers are pointing up and the listener is down here. So the next thing to do is to point the speaker down at the listener. And what you'll begin to see is that as you do that, let's see. Yep, as we point the speakers down, what happens is you end up having a wonderful sort of graph where, once again, you get more frequencies aimed down. And so it's a big difference between what we saw with the gap in between and also what we saw with the just raising it. So ideally, you need to have both height and angling down. Now, some speakers have a second hole in the bottom to angle the speaker down a certain way, or you can buy adapters that tilt the speaker down. You have to be careful when using these adapters that you don't put the weight of the speaker on the stand so that it falls over. And what generally I do to prevent that is the third leg of the speaker stand, because there's 3 legs. What I do is I put the third leg in front of the speaker so that the speaker rests on the third leg and is less likely to fall over. Now, that should be, you can see here, that's a very even coverage of the room. What happens, for example, when you go to some of these events and it's just a DJ table in the middle, and, you know, let's say they put them up on speaker stands, you know, and what happens is they're only about, say, 2 meters, and they only aim forward at the listener like so. So what you get here is just this weird sort of really hot spot right in front of the speakers, and then it just sort of gets quiet. Now, guys, you might think that this is great for noise control, but most of the time, you know, remember that there are people in the audience sitting around the room and they really don't get to hear anything. And then, you know, the sound comes out down to this area and then bounces back up and it all sounds like a mess. Or, you know, there's so much, you know, yelling and things like that people on the side, they can't really hear the music. Let's see what happens when you raise it another meter or 3 feet. So we'll raise it 3 feet. And then magically, just by raising it 3 feet, you can see that there is all of a sudden a much more louder zone. Then what we'll do is, why don't we aim it down again at the audience, and then there you have it. So even if you just put the 2 speakers next to the DJ booth and you aim them up high and then you tilt them down, can you see how much more concentrated the sound gets in general? So the general rule is the I'm going to turn the mapping off so you can see here in the bottom, the higher the better, as well as if you can aim it down. If you can go high and aim it down, instant sound quality. Also because when you because as you can see here, sound always travels in a cone from the speaker. And so not only is it going left and right, it's also going up and down. So when you have it going up like this, it's actually bouncing off the ceilings, and the reflections are, muddying the sound and all that sort of stuff. So by aiming it down, you can imagine the cone is actually not bouncing off the ceilings, and it's going towards the people. So you sort of get like free loudness just by being able to do that. Now, some speakers like the QSCs have a adjustable, like you can turn the speaker hole so it can either be straight up or tilted. Some other speakers like the JBL's PRX series, they have two holes, one for straight up and one for tilting. And like I said before, you can buy speaker adapters with a variable tilt that you can introduce and control a certain amount of tilt depending on what your requirements are for that room. Now, that's two speakers. Let's say, for example, we move these speakers all the way back to the corners of the room, because putting them in the corner of the room actually gives us a little bit of extra bass, because the bass frequencies rebound off the corners. So against the wall, the bass gets a slight increase, and against the corner, because there's two walls, the bass gets a greater increase. Let's now talk about putting the speakers all the way on the corners if you have long enough cables. So if we raise this to 3 meters, angle it down at the audience, what we're going to get is this. There we go. So let's now raise this another meter, which is now starting to be, there you go. So by raising it to another meter, you basically get a wonderful even distribution across the room, or even half a meter. So say, for example, if we go here, 3.5, 3.5. Okay, so at 3.5 meters, even putting them in the corners of the room and aiming them roughly in the middle of the room, you get a nice even distribution, and it doesn't blow out to the other rooms or the foyer or the lobby or the waiting room or whatever. And you basically can keep it all concentrated. Now, it says here on the chart that it's 117. That's obviously a lot less louder than 138, but 117 is still very loud and is capable of causing hearing damage very, very quickly. Now, that's the ideal situation if you have two speakers. So again, just to quickly recap, what are we looking for when we're looking for speaker setup? We're looking for speakers that are high up. We're looking for speakers that are pointing down. If you are doing an event, once again, set your speakers as high as you can, as safe as you can. Now, this might mean that you might need to invest in a set of speaker stands that are decent, or you may have to, not use the cheap ones that sometimes rental companies offer, because if you put them out too high, it's like climbing a ladder. You don't go to the tallest rung because you lose your balance and fall. You don't stick it all the way out till the last hole, because the metal might not have enough support, and the speaker might fall, land on someone. You got serious problems there. But the general rule is the higher the better, plus pointing down the better. Okay, so that's two speakers. Let's talk about the other thing that matters for a lot of people, especially at dance events, which is bass. Now, with bass, what we're going to do is we're going to I'm going to talk about the standard setup, which is, and I'm sure you've seen this all before, you know, sometimes you have two speakers, and then what happens is you have two subwoofers underneath the two speakers. So it's sort of like you have a subwoofer here, then you have a speaker pole, then you have the other speaker on top, right? So if I put these here, right, let's just say underneath that, so I can still click it. Okay, let's see what happens when I turn the mapping back on. So a lot of the time, and this is another pet peeve I have with a lot of events, right? A lot of the time, you're going to see people like basically, I'm just going to turn this sideways so you can see like a frontal view. But a lot of the time, people just face the speakers directly at people. Now, the problem with that is, if you look at the diagram, the cones go sideways, and so basically what happens is that you end up bouncing a lot of sound energy off the walls, and then they reflect back on, and that's like having a lot of echoes in weird space, and it does funny things to the audio, and it doesn't sound good. So what happens is what people should do is they should slightly toe the speakers in and turn them in so it faces the sound away from the corners. Now, with bass, it doesn't matter so much, because with bass, the frequencies are what we call omnidirectional. They go everywhere. But with the highs, you can direct that away from the walls and onto your audience. So if I turn this back to the normal orientation, you'll see now that there is a large drop-off in level, and the frequency response is currently about that much. Now, let's keep going. So what happens when you have a setup like this? Most people will think, oh, there's more bass because there's two subwoofers, and you know, people generally cheap out, and what they do is they, you know, put two poles underneath here and here. It's very hard to put two poles that are 3.5 meters high. So why don't we make it back to the usual 2 meters and see what happens to the sound? So this is the standard sound setup. So this here looks more standard. We have two speakers, both of them face forwards at the listener, and so when you look at it from the side, it usually looks something like this, right? That's a very, just imagine them there on top of each other, but it usually looks something like this, right? And then you've got two poles between them. I'm sure we've seen those at a lot of events. Now, what happens with the sound? We're going to see that right now. Show mapping. We're going to change this to bass. Now, this is a problem called power alley. And what that basically means is that I'm going to turn off the tops. Okay, so now you can see this is all the bass, right? At 80 hertz for those who are a bit more technically minded. What happens is that the two subwoofers, the low frequencies are canceling each other out. And as I move one subwoofer closer to the other, you'll see that it gradually becomes more. So first of all, if you imagine that this is just one subwoofer unit, you see a smooth, even distribution of bass. As the subwoofers get further apart, frequencies between them begin to cancel out, and then it looks like something that probably can't be discussed online. The thing is, though, at different frequencies, the separation is different. So can you see how at 50 hertz it looks like this, and then at 100 hertz it looks like that? So at all the different frequencies, at the lower frequencies, it's great, but as you get higher up into the 800, 100 hertz, you can see that it starts to have that power alley. So the only consistent bass across all the frequencies, which is important for a smooth sound, is straight down the middle, and we call that power alley. Now, what if we just use one subwoofer? We can see that it's very smooth, and if we just turned it all the way up, it would just get louder and louder and louder and hopefully flood the room. But turning up a subwoofer very loud is the same as driving a car and driving the car at very high revs. It stresses out the engine, it adds wear and tear, and unless you're racing, it probably isn't a great experience. So what we want in audio is actually to not drive things hard, because when we don't turn things up and we don't hear the distortion, the sound is clean, we have less risk of damaging equipment, and we also make sure that it's smooth enough to basically play well. This is very important for all genres of music. Going back to our example, let's see what happens in the normal standard to the bass when we have everything going at the same time. And you can see that all of a sudden, this graph doesn't look that great. And the reason this graph doesn't look that great is because all four speakers are actually putting out the same bass energy, the same frequencies, right? And so actually, it's not just two speakers canceling each other, it's four speakers all canceling each other at those frequencies. And this is really important because what happens is we need to understand what we can do about this. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Let's just talk about the immediate solution for this problem. The first immediate solution is to just use one subwoofer and move that subwoofer into the middle. Okay? Now, what happens then is that on a lot of speakers, you have a switch that basically turns off the low frequencies from the speakers at the speakers, so that they don't put out bass frequencies, which is very handy if you need a subwoofer. And what we're going to do is we're going to put a low pass filter at those frequencies. So now if I wrong one. I don't want to low pass it. I actually want to high pass it. So if I put, say, something at 80, and then I high pass it, and then I high pass this at 80 as well. Okay. And then for this speaker, I actually want to avoid having a issue there. So I am going to So what's going to happen here right now is we should have there you go. So in the side view, you can see that the sub is putting out all the bass, and the sub is putting out all the bass, and the other speakers are not. Now, what that means is that as we go down, most of the lower frequencies, 63 hertz, are all being produced by the subwoofer until the higher frequencies start coming through, and you can see that from the bottom chart. So now the subwoofer is providing most of the bass, and you have a lovely sort of room bass response. Now what you can do is, to make it even better, you can actually get what they call a dual 18, which is a dual subwoofer, which is two subwoofers put side to side, or you can get two of the same model subwoofer and then basically just put the two together, like literally put them right next to each other. And what that does is that will make them act like one big subwoofer, right? And then that will actually, that does two things. You can either double the bass, or you can have the same amount of bass but much cleaner, because both subwoofers are working half as hard. So if we look at the room, we look at the sources, and we look at the side view of the room, we see now across the levels of the bass, it is now doubly as loud, and all the way up to 100 hertz, where the tops start taking over. And so you can see this is a representation of what the frequencies are doing. Now, some of you might have seen this in effect at Step Your Game Up a couple of years ago, because this is actually the hands down easiest method for consistent sound across most rooms and venues. So if you look at the side view here at the bottom, if I turn this around for you guys to see side, this is what it would look like. Subwoofer array subwoofer array next to each other. I'm going to zoom in so you guys can see this. Right, a subwoofer array next to each other, and then two speakers on the side. Now, these speakers are still 2 meters. Let's see what happens to the bass when I move these speakers back under and have them. So you can see already we have the power alley problem. So this is why you should never, ever, ever put subwoofers too far apart. You can see both on the top view and the side view, there is a central band of power, but it only stays in the central band. Watch what happens again when you move the subwoofers back in the middle, close together. And what you see is a very, very smooth, centered amount of bass all the way up to, you know, whatever the frequencies that you're crossing over are at. Now, on top of that, let's talk about flying the speakers higher up. So let's put another meter, another 3 feet of speakers up. And then let's also use what we've learned before and point them down at the listeners and tilt them down. Okay, so now if we look at all the frequencies, we can see that from the low end, it's very smooth, and then it gradually transitions over to the top speakers, where it then basically becomes that, and then you have room coverage. Now, if your cables are long enough, you can put these in the corners, and we'll just look at that again. Okay, so we'll start from the lowest of the low frequencies, and then as it goes up, so it's a low and it goes up. Coverage, right? So you get great coverage. This is in effect probably a cheat code for good sound. Okay, so we'll just look at the side view. So this is what it should look like, having a sub array in the middle and then having two speakers flying higher or up higher, pointing down at the audience or at the dancers or whatever the audience area is. Now, I generally like to focus the speaker energy onto the battle area. I find that is it helps with noise control, and then obviously the battle area gets the best sound. So in terms of that, that's where my general suggestions are. Okay, and if we go back to broadband, which is most of the sound, you can see that it's actually very smooth overall. If we look at the overall level of sound, instead of just how we hear, you will see that it is actually very, very even all the way through. And that's the goal of setting up a sound system. Now, what are the downsides of this? Well, obviously, if the DJ is in the middle, then you have to deal with things like rumble and thudding and bass thudding. And so if you're using turntables, you need to be aware of that. And you can solve that. Sorry, if you're using turntables with vinyl, even Serato and digital vinyl systems, you have to be aware of how having a good table that's sturdy, having vibration, anti-vibration measures, whatever they may be, so that a DJ can play without the needles jumping up and down. Now, of course, if you're using a controller, you don't have any of those problems. That is going to be, the way moving forward if you had the budget. And you can see here, even if you take out one subwoofer, because let's say, for example, you have a studio and they have the speakers at the sides on the walls, and you bring in you hire one subwoofer, what you're going to see is basically the same even pattern across the room like that. So that's going to be the best option. If you know that the studio already has a speaker set up like this, then you just need to, make it slightly better. Your best option is to put a subwoofer in the middle near the DJ, and you can see that no matter where I move this subwoofer, it generally is the energy in the room is generally quite even. Now, what happens in some studio spaces where the subwoofer is in the corner underneath like in a corner of the room. So what you'll see here is this is probably a bit more unfortunate, but it's very important to note that you still get that amazing evenness. What we're looking for is evenness of sound, right? And that's very important. And we get that. Where the problem happens is if in some studios you have two subwoofers in two areas, and then as soon as you do that, you see that you have the power alley, and it never goes away, which is why most of the times at these events, when there's multiple subwoofers just, put randomly in the middle here like this, people always say, oh, there's not enough bass, and people turn it up. And then some people in some areas say, oh, the bass is too loud. And then some people say, oh no, the bass is just fine. And it gets very hard to control that sort of bass spillage. And then, equipment blows, circuit breakers get tripped, and this and that. So that's where, we have to be mindful of knowing what to do with speaker placement, which is the easiest thing you can do if you're just going to hire a space. So just to recap, if the studio already has speakers in the right position and you just need to hire one subwoofer, All you need to do is put the subwoofer in the middle near the DJ booth and the MCs and the host. And if you can't do that, the next option is to place it in a corner. And you get that. Okay? So these are the best options. If you have the ability to, you can put a second subwoofer right next to the first subwoofer and sort of make it like a double subwoofer. Okay? And then you get something like that. Now, if the studio has speakers but they're not good, or you want to hire a full system, you should generally put the speakers as high as you can, as safely as you can, tilting them down. And then what you get is a little bit further halfway through the room, and what you get is this wonderful even coverage across the room. And as we look at all of these patterns, you see roughly the same sort of there we go, roughly the same sort of pattern. So I'm just running through the frequencies for you to see. Now, overall, you get this sort of smooth line. Nothing is lots of bass, lots of bass, and the highs you get from the speakers. So that is pretty much 101. Now, if we want to go more advanced in this, you know, there are things like, well, David, why did you set the filters like this and all the crossovers and all of that? And I also showed you why it was very important, because if you don't set it, you have 4 speakers and they're just basically fighting each other and canceling each other out. It's like 4 people trying to have an argument instead of 4 people handling each section of their business. But even if you don't do that, so for example, if I turn off all these filters, okay, even if I turn off all these filters and have them all just sort of play, you know, full range, I guess. One second. Even if you just knew nothing about sound and you just hooked up some speakers, you know, to all the different jacks and things like that, and then you started playing, following this general example, you can see that it's actually very even and, you know, very easy to do. So that would be the fastest way of getting, and the best way of getting good sound in a general studio room. Now, just for comparison, I'm going to reactivate the filters. Okay. So if I activate the filters again, and I activate the filters again, activate, like putting in the crossovers as they call it, right? All that really does is means that the highs don't play a lot of the bass, and the subwoofers don't play the highs that the other speakers are supposed to be doing, which means that each individual speaker can play a bit louder, and that little bit louder is enough to, quite frankly, be the difference between people really enjoying the system, or people, you know, going, oh, I can't hear anything, or can you please turn it up? So if I do that frequency graph thing for you guys to see again, you can see that now with the crossover frequencies in, you can see that the gradual, like there's more evenness and transition and, you know, bass without it interfering and, you know, interfering with each other. So there you go. That is basically a quick guide to how, you know, not only does how sound works, but what you should do if you're holding an event in a studio space. Now, keep in mind, I know this video is about studio spaces, but actually These general principles also hold for if you're using a hall or if you're using a bigger venue. It just basically means you need either bigger speakers or more power. Now, on the subject of power, should you get 12s or 15s? That depends. That depends on several factors. If we, for example, let's say, for example, we go back to this very quickly. Let's say, for example, in this example, we use a 15, a QSC 15. We ignore, actually, we'll use this QSC, put it 3 meters, and we'll put it right here, okay? Now, this QSC 15-inch speaker is going to be a little bit louder, of course. If I then put the filter in for 80 hertz, what we're going to see basically is a situation where this will have this has less coverage because of the way the KWs work. So the KWs are more focused and they're more long throw. So if you were to, for example, do it lengthwise, you might want to consider the KWs. But the point that I'm trying to make is that fundamentally speaking, in a space like a studio space like this, because the subwoofers are doing the heavy lifting of the bass, having something like a 15 can actually be detrimental to your sound, because there is such a thing as when stuff becomes too big. And so again, going back to what I was saying about sound, you know, there's, without talking about like specific models of speakers or things like that, there are situations where you can have, you know, where 2 12s and a sub, or 2 12s and 2 subs are absolutely sufficient. And, you know, having 15s just basically means having higher power handling, but, you know, you potentially could get that through, you know, getting better 12-inch speakers. Having said that though, the price difference between getting 12s and 15s, again, you probably could use that to get a better DJ, get a better sub, you know, get a sub, or even get a subwoofer even, you know. So these are the sort of budgetary things that you'd have to consider when planning your event. But hopefully this 50-minute video has basically explained to you the beginning basics of how to set up sound in a studio space or in a studio size space in general, so that you can have maximum enjoyment of basically the music, which, as my crew always says, is what we're here for. Yo, what up? This is Seb One's Music Corner. This is Seb One representing Mop Top Family, New York City. Peace.